the hell? Oh, well, there's the problem. This pan over here, and it looks like somebody's actually taking the fuel pump relay out. Of course, it's a setup, right? The point is, you come out, your car won't start. Now what, right? So as I had mentioned in the previous video, you might be inclined to check it out when I was talking about troubleshooting fuel pressure issues. The acronym I use is FACTS. So let's just stick to the facts. Fuel, air, compression, timing, spark. No necessarily in that order. Always do the easiest first, right? So in the previous video, as I had mentioned, we were looking at fuel and fuel pressure and how you can go about checking that. So in this particular instance, I've got the car dummied, set up so that we can actually simulate a situation where we want to check the spark, right? So that's the intention here. Full disclosure, it's a complete setup. There's nothing wrong with the car. So, point to this video, troubleshooting ignition systems on the SX4. I can't speak to much else, the SX4. So as a coil and plug ignition system, of course, I'll refer you to my previous video. Let's get access to the coil and plugs. Good place to start, obviously. So we'll take off the duct. Two 10mm bolts. Just pop the two clips on the air filter housing. Move it back. We should be able to pretty much lift this up. And we get a better look at what we're dealing with here. So again, four ignition coils, coil and plug, 3-wire setup, and again, the whole point to this exercise is to hypothetically have a scenario where we're unsure if we have spark or not. So I believe it's 8mm bolts. Just a single through bolt that holds the coil and plug assembly down. And of course we've got twisting action, and hopefully we can pull it out. So we've still got it connected. Here's the coil and plug assembly, and of course the boot that reaches down into the plug itself. So simple place to start. In fact, the manual actually shows you how to do this procedure. Here in the manual, it actually shows you this exact procedure. And it makes sure, it gives you a warning here. It tells you to disconnect the ignition couplers, the injector couplers. So of course we're talking about the connectors on the injectors. They're easily accessible back here on the harness. You can pull them. Again, I already have the fuel system disabled because I've pulled the fuel relay, so I'm going to dispense with that. But you can see here, they're just asking you to pull the coil with the plug. Ideally, it would be the plug from the cylinder itself, so you can actually rule that out, obviously. And we're actually going to check to see if we have spark at the plug. So, let's do that. So you can see on my setup here, since I'm working by myself, I didn't actually pull the plug, but I'm using a separate plug that's got a little alligator clip on it. Make things a wee bit easier. But the idea is the same. So you're taking the plug, you're simply grounding the exterior casing of the plug, just as it would be in the block, and you're checking to see if the coil is capable of firing the plug. So hopefully we can actually see the plug actually light. Let me ring the engine over, we'll see what happens. Okay, so hopefully you could see on the camera that you could in fact see the spark jumping between the two electrodes. And in this scenario, if it were a real world scenario, well, it looks like you have spark. So time to start thinking about moving on in the troubleshooting process and start to consider other things. So let's see if there's a couple other methods that we can actually use. We have this, which, to be quite honest, I've never used before, but it's just an inline spark tester basically. So you put this side on the boot side and this side down on the plug. So let's give this a shot. And you can also use the Paul Danner method, where you actually pull the spark to ground. So that is to say that you would take your alligator clip, put it to a solid, good known ground, and pull the spark with the actual tip of the tool, and you should be able to see the spark jump very clearly. There's a wee bit of risk involved with that, so I'm not going to actually show you that. I should mention at this point, this is a no start scenario. If you have a misfire, obviously if it's an ignition related misfire, you could use these same techniques to narrow down if any particular cylinder is actually misfiring. Good place to start obviously is the DTCs. Hook up your scan tool, check to see if it actually points to which cylinder, keeping in mind that that's just extrapolated data, but it's a good starting point, probably the simplest. It will actually go to more complicated, more expansive tooling as we actually go step through the video. Obviously not everybody's going to have that, but hopefully we're getting the point across to what we're trying to achieve here. Okay, so the inline spark tester is in position. Dim the lighting a wee bit again. Well, that was actually pretty good. I could see that from inside the car. I'm actually quite impressed with that. That's quite a clear indication that there is in fact spark available, at least down to the plug, right? Now whether it's crossing the plug, again, that would be an unknown since the plug is still in the actual in the cylinder head, obviously. So again, this would be a hypothetical scenario where we've confirmed that there is spark, so now we could move on. But let's assume that there was no spark. Now what? What do we do? Well, if there is no spark, time to look a wee bit deeper, right? So as I said, I'm not going to go through this rigmarole again. That's all there on the previous video for you to actually consider. In the interest of expediency, let's make the assumption that you know that the 3 wires on the coil that we're actually dealing with, these 3 wires that are on the connector here, there's a 12-volt supply coming from the junction box. That 12-volt supply is common to all 4 ignition coils. And there's a ground. There's a split ground, but essentially it's a common ground through the system as well. And there's a trigger signal that actually comes from the ECU. The ECU sitting here obviously looks at all the inputs from the sensors from the engine, namely the crank position sensor, the cam position sensor. Looks at all the variables, all the loads that are actually acting on the engine, what state of operation is the engine actually in, and then actually makes adjustments from the basic timing in order to trigger the coil, in order to fire the plug for optimum operation of the engine. Neglecting all the adaptive strategies that are involved in stuff. The ECM actually controls the timing. So, as I said, 12-volt supply, a ground, and a trigger. If we're missing any of those, we could be dead in the water as far as spark is concerned. So let's just briefly look at the drawing so you can understand what I'm talking about. I don't want to rehash again the theory of operation, but briefly look at the drawing so you know what I'm talking about. So as I had mentioned, you can see here we have a couple of fuses. The ignition switch itself, of course, actually applying the 12-volt supply to the coils. You can see it come up here, and it's actually the black and white wire. And you can see there's a black and white wire providing 12 volts to the coil assembly. There's a hard ground off of the internal igniter that's in each and every coil assembly. So each black wire is a solid ground. And of course you can see coming from the engine control module, item 10 here, you can see there's a separate line. Each has a green, is it coded with a green color code. One's solid green, the other 3 are green and an additional color, stripe I guess. And that's actually the trigger signal that actually comes to the coil, each coil. So 12 volts, a ground, and all important, the trigger signal telling the coil when to actually charge and, more importantly, discharge or fire the coil, or fire the plug, I should say. So we'll take a look at that on the car. Okay, so I'm hooked up to the black and white wire, which, if you recall from the schematic, the black and white wire is actually the 12-volt line. So want to put the car, the ignition switch to the run position, we should see 12 volts on that line. And we do. So that's 1 out of 3 wires that we can, at least on this particular coil assembly, the number 4 plug that I'm dealing with here on the aft side of the engine. I hope that's not the number 4, no, the number 1. I think it's the number 4. So it looks like we've got a good 12 volt feed to that. Skeptics in the audience are going to say, well, that's not a legitimate check. There's no load on that. You're just checking it with a meter. Okay, fair enough. This is a pretty high watt little test light. I've actually made sure that there was a high watt test light. Particularly, I can't tell you the actual amperage rating, but you'll see by the brightness, it's a pretty good sized lamp in there. So, looks like we've got a good 12 volt supply there. I'm going to toggle over to the black wire, which, if you recall, is the actual hard ground on the system. And again, looks like we have 0 volts. Again, skeptics are going to say that's not good enough. Of course, if I take the lead right off, you know, you'll see, well, it goes voltage there, I guess. But they'll say, well, again, no loaded, so I'll check it with a test light. I'll toggle my test light over to positive this time. So the alligator's on positive, and then I'll just use the probe. We'll check for ground, and that's lit as well. So loaded ground test. Seems good to me. So we've got a good power, good 12 volt supply, good and a good ground on both accounts. So here's what it gets a wee bit tricky. The trigger pulse, which comes from, sorry, it wasn't in frame actually last time. My apologies, I didn't notice that at the time. From the engine control module itself, that sits just right here outside the battery. It actually triggers each coil independently, of course, in order to fire the plug in the right sequence, in order to optimize the performance of the engine, with taking into account all the operating parameters, right? I already mentioned that. But that pulse is only between 4 and 5 volts and is extremely narrow. So I think it's extremely unlikely we're going to actually see anything on the meter. But because some of you will be restricted to only operating with a meter, I'm going to actually crank the engine over, and we'll see what the meter actually picks up. Hopefully it picks up something, and it should be at least a very rough estimate what you might see on a meter if that's all the tooling you actually have. So I'm going to go to the green wire now, if you recall. The green wire, and then one solid green, and the other 3 are encoded with a stripe, depending on the cylinder you're dealing with. I'll crank it over, and we'll actually see what we get, if anything. But the pulse is very narrow, timeline wise, so we might not see anything. That was kind of interesting, I guess, because the meter will just average whatever it actually sees. It did in fact read something. However, it's kind of meaningless, right? Because we have no sense of whether the pulse is happening, whether it's the right voltage, whether it's the right profile. It's kind of meaningless. So not completely meaningless. Something is happening there on the trigger line, at least you could see with the meter, but really couldn't tell anything beyond that. Fortunately, the Suzuki manual never really lets us down. So in the Suzuki manual, it actually has waveforms, and waveform number 9 is actually the ignition coil signal. So not only will it give you your setup for your scope with respect to voltage and time base, it actually gives you a profile of what the pulse actually looks like. So that's what it should actually look like. So I'm going to set up my scope here. I realize that some of you watching this won't have a scope available to you. However, that's why I did show you on the meter, to give you some sense of what you should be looking for. Okay, so I've got my scope hooked up. I'm on the green wire of the 3 wires on the three wire coil on plug assembly. Green wire is, of course, the trigger wire. So let me take you onto the scope here. Hopefully I can get you a decent shot here. My son is in the car, so he can crank it for us now. Okay, go ahead, crank it. Okay. Okay, so let's stop that. And then we can go back through the frames here. So there's an ignition pulse there. Hopefully you can see that in decent detail. So there's the trigger pulse there. So you can see that if we bring the measurement tool into play here, that it is in fact about 4.5 volts there. And I'm on a time base of, well, I guess we can take some measurements on how wide the pulse is as well. Of course, this would be a function of RPM as well. Sorry, wrong one. And you can see the pulse there is about 42, yeah, that's right, about 42 milliseconds wide. So, and of course, appreciate that on the leading edge here, the coil is actually charging, and on the trailing edge here is when the coil field will actually collapse, and that's when it actually fires the plug. Hopefully that all made some sense with respect to what was going on with the 3 wires in the system and what you can actually do. Now, appreciate that when it comes to the engine control module here, that it, of course, is only acting on its inputs, and if the inputs are not correct, if you recall from the drawing, although I didn't point it out at the time and I probably should have, it is looking at the crank and cam sensor for inputs. So if there's an anomaly with a signal input from either, possibly both of these sensors, that would be unlikely, but either of these signals, of course, it could corrupt the input. And of course, the engine control module is only acting on what it actually sees with respect to engine rotation. So if those are missing, you still may not have an ignition trigger signal. So beyond the scope of this particular video, but in another video to come, perhaps we'll take a closer look at the signals that come from the crank sensor and the cam position sensor. One's just a variable reluctance sensor as far as I can tell, and the other one looks like a Hall effect. But those are two high authority sensors that are actually in the engine, and certainly ignition critical sensors. If those are corrupted, you still may not have a spark. And yeah, so video to follow in the future. If anybody's interested, let me know in the comments. We'll take a look at the cam and crank sensors, because well, of course, the entire engine operation depends on those sensors. So as I said, high authority sensors. So that's it, boys. Hopefully that made some sense. Hopefully I didn't ramble on too long. Hopefully I got the point across, and we'll leave it at that for now. That's it. Cheers, boys.